A homeless woman in a borrowed green dress stood in the middle of a billionaire's wedding and said something that made every guest in the room stop breathing. But let me start from the beginning. 6 months after his wife left him for a richer man, Frank Reed got her wedding invitation. He couldn't go alone, so he offered $300 to a woman who slept in a shelter and read art books on a bench outside his building. He thought she'd help him look like he had moved on. He had no idea she would be the one who changed everything, not for the guests, not for his ex-wife, but for him. Frank Reed had a routine, and he held on to it the way a man holds onto a rope in deep water. Every morning he woke at 5:15, packed his daughter's lunch before she opened her eyes, ironed his shirt in the half-dark kitchen, and drove 22 minutes to the Langford Hotel, where he had worked as operations manager for the past 6 years. He was good at his job, the kind of good that nobody celebrated but everybody relied on. When a pipe burst on the 4th floor at 2 in the morning, Frank answered the phone. When the weekend staff called in sick during a fully booked holiday weekend, Frank covered the shift himself. He never complained. He never asked for recognition. He simply showed up every single day because that was who he was. And for a long time, that had been enough. His daughter Zoe was 7, bright, curious, and far too perceptive for her age. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she asked questions that no 7-year-old should know how to ask. Frank raised her alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like laundry detergent and old carpet. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. He had turned down 2 promotions in the past 3 years, both requiring extended travel because he refused to be the kind of father who disappeared. His own father had done that, walked out when Frank was 9 and never came back. Frank swore on everything he had that his daughter would never know what that felt like. His ex-wife Elena Grant had seen things differently. She once told him during one of their last arguments that stability was just another word for standing still. She wanted more money, more visibility, more of the life she saw other people living on social media and at dinner parties they couldn't afford. Frank had loved her. He had loved her in the quiet, steady way he did everything without fanfare, without performance. But for Elena, quiet love wasn't enough. She needed it loud. She needed it expensive. And when she met Richard Caldwell at a fundraiser Frank hadn't wanted to attend, she found exactly the volume she was looking for. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Frank came home from work on a Wednesday evening and found a cream-colored envelope slipped under his door. His name was written in gold calligraphy. Inside was a wedding invitation, heavy cardstock, embossed edges, a venue address he didn't recognize, but could already picture columns, chandeliers, a driveway lined with imported cars. Elena was marrying Richard Caldwell. At the bottom of the card, in Elena's handwriting, a single line, "Hope you're doing well." Frank stood in the kitchen holding that card under the overhead light, reading the line again and again. Hope you're doing well. Not a question, not concern, a verdict. She had already decided he wasn't doing well, and this was her way of confirming it from the other side of her new life. That night, Frank sat on the edge of Zoe's bed and read her favorite story, the one about the bear who crossed the river to find his family. Zoe listened with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her eyes heavy but fighting sleep. When he finished the last page, he closed the book quietly and reached for the lamp. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank smoothed the hair from her forehead. "No, baby, Daddy's fine." But Zoe looked at him, the way she sometimes did, like she could see straight through the wall he built around himself, and Frank had to look away first. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and pulled the door halfway shut behind him. After she fell asleep, he sat alone in the living room with the invitation on the coffee table. He wasn't going to go. That was the rational decision. There was no reason to walk into a room full of people who would look at him with pity, people who had already heard Elena's version of the story, that she had outgrown him, that he lacked vision, that she deserved better. But something burned in his chest that wouldn't quiet down. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't anger. It was the need to prove to himself, to her, to whoever was watching, that he was not the man she had reduced him to. He didn't want to go to that wedding to cause a scene. He wanted to walk in, stand tall, and walk out with his dignity intact. He wanted his daughter to have a father who didn't hide from hard things. He decided to go. The next question was harder. Who would he bring? Frank didn't have many close friends. The divorce had been a social earthquake. Most of their mutual acquaintances had drifted toward Elena, who was more charming at parties, more active on social media, more visible in every room she entered. Frank was left with his work colleagues, his daughter, and his routine. He couldn't show up alone. Walking in without someone beside him would confirm everything Elena believed about him, that he was a man the world had moved past. That was when he thought of the woman outside his building. He had noticed her for months, always sitting on the same bench near the entrance, always reading. She had been there even before the divorce. Frank remembered seeing her with the same worn book the afternoon he carried Elena's last box to the car. Rain or shine, morning or dusk, she was there with a different book each week. Sometimes a thick novel, sometimes a thin paperback with a cracked spine. She never asked anyone for money. She never spoke unless spoken to. Once Frank had seen her sketching in a worn notebook quick, confident lines, a hand that had clearly been trained somewhere serious. He had nodded at her a few mornings, and she had nodded back. That was the extent of their relationship. Her name, he would learn, was Naomi Hart. The following Tuesday, he approached her on his way home from work, his tie loosened at the collar. She was reading a book on color theory, a heavy textbook you'd find in an art school classroom, not on a sidewalk bench in the middle of the city. "I have an unusual question," Frank said, standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Naomi looked up. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, not hostile, but not welcoming either. "Most people who say that are about to ask something boring." Frank almost smiled. "My ex-wife is getting married this Saturday. Big wedding, fancy venue. I need someone to go with me." Naomi closed the book slowly, keeping her thumb between the pages. "And you're asking the woman who sleeps in a shelter." "I'm asking the woman who reads color theory on a Tuesday." Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but recognition. She studied him for a long moment the way someone studies a painting they haven't decided whether to trust. "How much?" she asked. $300. "That's a lot of money for company." "It's a lot of pride on the line." Naomi considered this. Then she said, "I'll go, but I have one condition. If anyone asks me a direct question about who I am or what I do, I don't lie. You can introduce me however you want, but if someone looks me in the eye and asks, I tell the truth." Frank hesitated. The whole point was to create an image, a story, a version of himself that didn't look defeated. Bringing someone who might reveal the arrangement could unravel everything. But there was something in the way Naomi said it, calm, non-negotiable, like a woman who had lost everything except the one thing she refused to surrender. "Deal," he said. On Friday evening, Frank took Naomi to a department store and bought her a dress. Nothing extravagant, a dark green gown, simple lines, a dress that didn't scream money but whispered good taste. Naomi picked it herself, running her fingers along the fabric with the care of someone who understood texture and form the way most people understood words. In the fitting room, she stood in front of the mirror without moving. Frank waited outside, checking his phone, assuming she was adjusting the fit. But when she finally stepped out, her eyes carried something he hadn't expected, not excitement, not gratitude, but a quiet grief. Like she was looking at a version of herself that had existed once before, everything fell apart. "You okay?" Frank asked. Naomi straightened the hem and met his eyes. "I used to own dresses like this. I used to go to gallery openings and talk about brushwork and light composition. I studied fine art before my mother got sick ovarian cancer, no insurance worth anything. I dropped out to cover the medical bills. Then the bills ate everything else." She ran her hand along the sleeve. "I used to dance too. Contemporary. My school had a company and I performed with them for 2 years. That was the last time I remember feeling truly free. She said it without self-pity, without asking for sympathy. Just fact. The way you'd read a line from someone else's biography. Frank didn't know what to say, so he said the only honest thing he could manage. You look like someone who belongs in that dress. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time, something close to warmth crossed her face. Let's go make your ex-wife uncomfortable. Saturday came with a sky full of copper light. Frank dropped Zoe off at his sister's house, kissed her forehead, and told her he'd be back before breakfast. You look handsome, Daddy, Zoe said from the doorway, still holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. Thank you, baby. Are you going to dance? Frank laughed a real laugh, the first in days. Probably not. He picked up Naomi at 6:30. She was waiting near the bench, same spot as always, but she looked entirely different. The green dress fit her like it had been made for someone who once knew how to carry herself in rooms full of important people. Her hair was pulled back a pair of borrowed earrings catching the fading sunlight. She stood when she saw his car, and for a moment, Frank forgot the arrangement entirely. For a moment, she was just a woman stepping into the evening light, and she was striking. They drove in near silence toward the address on the invitation, a private estate on the outskirts of the city hidden behind iron gates and long driveways lined with oak trees. Frank gripped the steering wheel a little tighter with every mile. He had a plan. Show up, look composed. Introduce Naomi as a friend, stay for 1 hour, leave with his dignity intact. What he didn't have was any idea what was actually waiting for him on the other side of those gates. The estate was worse than Frank had imagined, not because it was ugly, but because it was perfect. Stone pillars framed the entrance. Strings of warm light hung between the trees like golden veins. Valets in black vests took the keys from arriving guests who stepped out of cars that cost more than Frank made in a year. A string quartet played somewhere behind the hedges, and the air smelled like jasmine and money. Frank pulled his car, a 12-year-old sedan, with a scratch on the passenger door to the front. The valet glanced at it, then at him with a flicker of something that wasn't quite judgment, but wasn't quite welcome either. Naomi stepped out on the other side and stopped. She stood at the edge of the driveway, her clutch pressed tight against her ribs, her eyes moving across the estate. The fountains, the linen-draped tables visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, the women in gowns that cost more than 6 months of shelter beds. Her jaw tightened. Her shoulders drew inward just slightly like a door beginning to close. Frank walked around the car and stood beside her. You all right? Naomi didn't answer right away. She drew a slow breath through her nose, held it, then let it go. Just give me a second. It wasn't fear. Frank could see that. It was something deeper, the weight of standing at the entrance of a world she had once belonged to and been quietly expelled from. Not by choice, by circumstance. By a stack of hospital bills and a system that didn't care how talented you were if you couldn't pay. Then Naomi lifted her chin. She straightened her back. She loosened her grip on the clutch and let her hand fall naturally to her side. And she walked forward, not with the rehearsed confidence of someone pretending, but with the hard-won steadiness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Frank followed her through the entrance. Inside the reception hall was vast, vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, tables set with white orchids and silverware that caught the light like small mirrors. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying champagne on silver trays. The guests were exactly who Frank had expected, business partners of Richard Caldwell Elena's new social circle, women in designer dresses, men who shook hands like they were closing deals even at a wedding. Frank recognized a few faces, people who had once sat at his dinner table, who had laughed at his jokes and eaten the food he cooked. Now they looked at him the way you look at someone you vaguely remember from a life you've moved on from. He heard the whispers before he saw the faces. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind her champagne glass. A man in a gray suit glanced at Frank, then at Naomi, then looked away too quickly. Frank caught one phrase clearly, Isn't that Elena's ex? He kept walking. Naomi kept pace beside him, her posture unbroken. They found a table near the far wall, and Frank poured himself a glass of water. He was already calculating how long he needed to stay before leaving would look natural rather than defeated. 1 hour. Maybe 90 minutes. Enough to be seen. Enough to prove he existed beyond Elena's narrative. But Naomi wasn't calculating. She was looking at the room, not at the people, but at the walls, specifically at a large oil painting that hung between two arched windows. It was an abstract piece, dark blues bleeding into burnt orange, with textured strokes that gave it an almost sculptural quality. Most of the guests had walked past it without a second glance. Naomi stood and crossed the room to study it. A woman was already standing near the painting, holding a glass of red wine, and looking at it with an attention that suggested she actually understood what she was seeing. She was in her early 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing a black dress with no jewelry except a single thin bracelet. Everything about her was deliberate and understated. Her name was Diane Calloway, and she was the creative director of a boutique design studio downtown, a studio that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Naomi stopped beside her. "The texture in the lower right," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He used a palette knife, but only in that corner. The rest is all brush. It's like he lost patience with precision and just let the paint speak." Diane turned and looked at Naomi. Not with suspicion, but with the sharp interest of someone who rarely heard anyone at these events talk about art as if it mattered. "Most people see the colors first," Diane said. "You went straight to the technique." Naomi tilted her head. "Color is what you feel. Technique is what the artist chose to do with that feeling. I've always been more interested in the choice." They talked for the next 20 minutes. Naomi spoke about composition and negative space, about how contemporary art often forgot that the body itself was a visual language, how she had once studied dance, not to perform, but to understand how movement and stillness could carry the same emotional weight as a painted line. Diane listened the way people listen when they've found something unexpected and don't want to interrupt it. "Where did you study?" Diane asked eventually. Naomi met her eyes without flinching. "I started at the Hargrove Institute. I didn't finish." Diane held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The best people I've ever worked with never did." Across the room, Frank watched this happen from a distance. He had expected Naomi to stay close to play the role of quiet companion, to fill the space beside him without drawing attention. Instead, she was standing in front of a painting he hadn't even noticed, holding a conversation with a woman who clearly mattered, and doing it without pretense. She wasn't performing. She was simply being who she had always been, the version of herself that poverty had buried but not killed. It unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. Later, during cocktail hour, a small group gathered near the bar. Frank stood among them, half listening to a man named Bradley talk about a golf trip when the conversation shifted. Someone asked Naomi how she and Frank had met. Naomi glanced at Frank, a quick, almost imperceptible look, and then she smiled. Not a nervous smile, a real one. "We're neighbors in a way," she said. "I see him every morning, rain or shine. He's always on time, always put together, always carrying something for his daughter." She looked at Frank as she said the next part, and her voice dropped half a register, becoming quieter but somehow more present. "He's the kind of man who stays when things get hard. And in my experience, that's the rarest thing in the world." The group went quiet. Not uncomfortable, just still. The kind of stillness that follows when someone says something that everyone in the room knows is true, but nobody expected to hear out loud. Frank felt something shift inside his chest. It was small but unmistakable, like a lock turning. For the first time in months, someone had described him not by what he lacked, but by what he had. Not by his salary or his car or the apartment with the old carpet. By something that couldn't be measured or lost or taken away in a divorce. He looked at Naomi, and the realization hit him with a force that caught him off guard. He had come to this wedding to prove something to Elena. But it was Naomi, a woman he'd paid $300 to stand beside him, who was showing him what he had been too defeated to see in himself. This was no longer about saving face. It hadn't been for a while. Elena watched all of this from across the room. She stood near the head table in her white gown, stunning, composed, every detail of the evening exactly as she had planned it. Richard Caldwell stood beside her, one hand on the small of her back, shaking hands with guests and smiling the way wealthy men smile at their own parties, generous but distant. Elena should have been happy. This was her night, her triumph, the proof that she had made the right choice. But her eyes kept drifting back to Frank. She watched him laugh at something Naomi said. She watched the way he stood a little straighter when Naomi was nearby, the way his shoulders had relaxed over the past hour in a way they never had during their marriage. And she saw the way other guests leaned in when Naomi spoke, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. The attention in the room was shifting slowly and invisibly away from the bride's table and toward a woman in a dark green dress who hadn't been on the guest list. Elena recognized her. It took a moment, a second look, a narrowing of the eyes, but she placed her. The woman on the bench. The woman who sat outside Frank's building every day reading books and sketching in a notebook. The woman Elena had walked past dozens of times without a word back when she still lived in that building and still called herself Frank's wife. Something tightened in Elena's expression. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the particular discomfort of a person who has built an entire story around a decision I left because he wasn't enough and is now watching that story develop cracks. She crossed the room during a break between toasts. The guests nearest to Frank and Naomi were still mid-conversation when Elena's voice cut through like a blade wrapped in silk. She addressed the small group, but her eyes were fixed on Naomi. "I have to say, Frank, your date is very charming." Her smile was perfect, practiced sharp at the edges. "But I feel like I've seen her before. In fact, I'm almost sure of it." She tilted her head, pretending to search her memory. "Didn't you used to sit outside Frank's building on that bench near the front door?" The group fell silent. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Elena continued, her voice light, almost playful, as if she were sharing an amusing coincidence. "You're the woman who's always out there with the books, right? The one who, forgive me if I'm wrong, doesn't actually live anywhere." The words hit the air and hung there. Every pair of eyes in the circle turned to Naomi. A few people glanced at Frank, then back at Naomi, recalculating everything they had heard in the last hour. The warmth that had filled the conversation just moments ago evaporated like steam off glass. Naomi stood perfectly still. She didn't look at Frank. She didn't look away from Elena. She held her gaze with an expression that carried no shame, no panic, and no performance. "Yes," Naomi said. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying just enough to reach every person in the circle without rising to a shout. "I don't have a home. I stay in a shelter most nights, and during the day I sit on that bench because it's near a public library and the light is good for reading." The silence deepened. Elena's smile flickered. She had expected denial, deflection, embarrassment. "Not this," Naomi continued. "And you're right that Frank invited me here tonight. He paid me $300 to be his companion." She let the words settle, watching them land on the faces around her. "But here's what he didn't pay for every word I've said about him tonight. That was free, and it was all true." She turned her gaze directly to Elena. "You asked if I've seen you before. I have. I watched you walk past me for months back when you still lived in that building. You never once looked at me, not because I was invisible, but because I wasn't useful to your story." Naomi's voice didn't waver. "So yes, I don't have an address, but dignity doesn't require one." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The string quartet played faintly from another room, but in this circle of guests, there was only silence and the echo of something that couldn't be taken back. Diane Calloway stood at the edge of the group. She had witnessed everything from Elena's calculated approach to Naomi's unshakable response. She said nothing, but her expression shifted in a way that only someone paying close attention would notice. The respect in her eyes didn't diminish. It deepened. Frank stood in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him like cold water. Naomi had told the truth, every part of it. The arrangement, the money, and the fact that despite all of that, what she had said about him was real. Now it was his turn. He could walk away. He could change the subject, laugh it off, steer the conversation toward something safer. He could protect the last shred of the image he had come here to build, or he could do the thing he had spent his entire life avoiding: stand in front of people who were already judging him and tell the truth about who he really was. He looked at Naomi. She wasn't waiting for him to rescue her. She didn't need rescuing. She had already saved herself. But Frank needed to save himself. Frank stepped forward. He didn't plan what he was going to say. He didn't rehearse it on the drive over or practice it in front of a mirror the way he had practiced his introduction. The words came from somewhere below his throat, from the place where 6 months of silence and shame had been sitting like a stone. "She's telling the truth," Frank said. Every face in the circle turned toward him. Elena's smile thinned. Richard Caldwell, who had drifted over from the head table, stood a few steps behind his bride with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man watching something inconvenient unfold at his own party. Frank looked at Naomi first, then at the guests, then at Elena. "I paid her to come with me tonight, $300, because I didn't want to walk in here alone and have every person in this room look at me the way you're all looking at me right now." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. He pressed them flat against his sides. "I came here to prove that I wasn't the man my ex-wife left behind, that I had moved on, that I was doing fine." He swallowed hard. "But that's not the truth. The truth is I came here because I was hurt. I was angry, and I wanted Elena to see that she was wrong about me." The room was still. Someone near the bar set down a glass, and the sound carried across the silence like a small bell. "But she wasn't wrong about everything," Frank continued. "I don't have a big house. I don't drive the kind of car that gets a second look. I've worked the same job for 6 years, and I'll probably work it for 6 more. I turned down every promotion that would have taken me away from my daughter for more than a weekend because she's 7 years old, and she needs her father to show up every single day, not when it's convenient, not when the schedule allows, but every day." He looked at Naomi, and something in his expression shifted from confession to clarity. "This woman told me the truth from the very beginning. She said she wouldn't lie for me, and she didn't. Everything she said tonight about who I am, about what kind of man I am, she meant every word. She's the most honest person in this room, and I brought her here under false pretenses. That's on me." Frank turned to Naomi fully. The guests, the chandeliers, the string quartet, all of it dissolved into background noise. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for bringing you here, for thinking I needed to pay someone to make me look like I was enough. I have a daughter at home who thinks I'm brave. Tonight I want to earn that." Naomi looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between sadness and recognition, like watching someone finally put down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of their body. She gave him a single nod. Frank turned back to the group. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for forgiveness. He simply stood there exposed and let the silence do what silence does when someone tells the truth in a room built on appearances. Elena stood motionless. Her lips were slightly parted, her champagne glass held at an angle she hadn't noticed. For the first time all evening, she was not in control of the room. She had orchestrated every detail of this wedding. The flowers, the seating chart, the lighting, the playlist, and none of it had prepared her for this. She had expected Frank to shrink. She had expected him to leave quietly, confirming every story she had told herself and others about why she left. Instead, he had stood in front of her guests and said the thing she had spent 6 months trying to bury, that leaving him had not been an upgrade. It had been a choice, and choices don't always age the way you expect them to. Something moved behind Elena's eyes. Not regret exactly, but the first thin crack in a certainty she had been polishing like glass. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder and leaned in. "Let's get back to the table," he murmured. Elena nodded, but as she turned, her gaze caught Frank one last time, and for a single breath, she looked like a woman who wasn't sure what she had won. The moment passed. The music resumed. Guests returned to their conversations with the careful enthusiasm of people trying to pretend nothing had happened. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a charge that wouldn't dissipate like the air after a thunderclap. Frank exhaled. He turned to Naomi. "We can go." But Naomi wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the dance floor. The string quartet had given way to a live band for the reception, and they had just started playing something slow, warm, a melody that drifted through the room like smoke. The floor was mostly empty. A few couples swayed near the edges, polite and careful, moving the way people move when they know they're being watched. Naomi set her clutch on the nearest table. She slipped off her borrowed earrings and placed them beside it. And then she walked onto the floor. She didn't ask anyone to join her. She didn't look at Frank or Elena or any of the guests who were beginning to turn their heads. She simply walked to the center of the empty space and let the music reach her. It started small, a slight movement in her shoulders, a shift in her weight from one foot to the other. Then her arms lifted slow and deliberate tracing arcs in the air with the precision of someone who had once spent hours in a studio learning how to make the body speak. Her spine curved and straightened. Her feet moved across the polished floor with a control that was unmistakable, not rehearsed for tonight, but remembered from years ago, stored somewhere deep in the muscle and bone, where the things we love never fully leave us. She danced the way she had talked about art, with honesty without performance. There was no flash, no dramatic spins, no attempt to impress. Just a woman moving through space with the kind of raw, unguarded grace that comes from having lost everything and discovering that the one thing left was still beautiful. The room went quiet for the third time that night. But this silence was different from the others. The first had been shock. The second had been discomfort. This one was reverence. Guests stopped mid-conversation. A waiter lowered his tray. Diane Calloway stood near the painting she had been admiring earlier, watching Naomi with an expression that had moved beyond professional interest into something more personal, the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to put everything you had into a craft and be told by the world that it wasn't enough. Someone near the bar took out a phone and started recording. Naomi danced for less than 3 minutes. When the song ended, she stopped, her chest rising and falling, her eyes bright. She didn't bow. She didn't smile for the camera. She simply walked back to the table, picked up her clutch and her earrings, and looked at Frank. "Now we can go," she said. They walked out of the estate together, not in shame, not in hurry, but with the quiet calm of two people who had walked into a fire and come out on the other side, still standing. Frank opened the car door for Naomi. She got in without a word. He drove them back toward the city with the windows cracked and the night air filling the car. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Naomi said, "You didn't have to do that." The apology. Frank kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, I did. Most people would have just left. Most people didn't bring you into that." Naomi looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said, about you being the kind of man who stays." Frank nodded. He didn't trust himself to say more without his voice breaking, so he just drove. He dropped her off near the shelter. She stepped out still in the green dress and leaned down to look at him through the open door. "Good night, Frank." "Good night, Naomi." She closed the door and walked into the building without looking back. The video surfaced the next morning. Someone at the wedding had posted the clip of Naomi dancing just 90 seconds of a woman in a green dress moving across a ballroom floor with an authenticity that algorithms couldn't manufacture. It wasn't the scandal that made it spread. It was the stillness of the room. The way every person in the frame had stopped what they were doing to watch. The way the camera trembled slightly, as if even the person filming understood they were witnessing something they wouldn't forget. The comments filled up fast. People wanted to know who she was. Not her name, not her story, just who she was. There was something in the way she moved that made strangers on the internet feel like they had been holding their breath without knowing it. 3 days after the wedding, Diane Calloway found Naomi through the shelter's front desk. She sat across from her in a small meeting room with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs a long way from the estate with its chandeliers and oil paintings. "I'm not offering you this because of what happened at the wedding," Diane said. "I'm offering it because of what happened before. The way you talked about that painting, about technique, about choice, about the body as a visual language. I've interviewed people with master's degrees who couldn't articulate what you said in 5 minutes next to a glass of wine." She folded her hands on the table. "I have a paid internship opening at my studio. It's entry-level, but it's real work, design, research, visual concepting, client presentations. I don't hire stories, Naomi. I hire eyes. And yours see things most people walk right past." Naomi held her gaze across the table. "I don't have an address for the paperwork." Diane reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. "The position comes with a housing stipend for the first 6 months. After that, you'll have enough for your own lease." Naomi opened the folder. She read every line. Then she closed it and held it against her chest the way she used to hold her books on that bench, not with desperation, but with care. "When do I start?" she asked. Frank picked up Zoe from his sister's house the next morning. His sister gave him a look at the door, a look that said she had seen the video and had questions, but she didn't say anything. She just handed him his daughter and a container of leftover breakfast. In the car, Zoe kicked her feet against the seat and asked, "How was the party, Daddy?" Frank glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It was different than I expected." "Did you dance?" He almost laughed. "No, but someone else did. Someone really brave." Zoe tilted her head the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. "Braver than you." Frank smiled. Not the forced kind, not the one he wore at work or at the wedding. A real one. Much braver. In the weeks that followed, Frank stopped checking Elena's social media. He stopped replaying their arguments in his head. He stopped measuring his life against the one she had chosen instead. He went to work, he came home, he read Zoe her bedtime story, and for the first time in 6 months, the routine didn't feel like a rope he was gripping to survive. It felt like a life he was choosing. One evening, sitting on the couch after Zoe had fallen asleep, Frank picked up his phone and typed a message to Naomi. They had exchanged numbers the night of the wedding, but neither had reached out until now. "You didn't steal the show," he wrote. "You owned it." The reply came 20 minutes later from a phone that was connected to the Wi-Fi in a small studio apartment, the first home Naomi had called hers in over 3 years. "So did you," she wrote back. "You just didn't know it yet." Frank read the message twice. Then he set the phone down, leaned back, and let the quiet of the apartment settle around him, not as emptiness, but as peace. The value of a man is not measured by his bank account or his status. It is measured by the moment he stands up for the truth, even when the truth costs him everything he came to protect. And sometimes the person the world overlooks is the one who lights up the entire room. Frank walked into that wedding trying to prove he wasn't a failure. He walked out realizing he never was. And Naomi, the woman with no home, no title, no invitation, she didn't just steal the show. She reminded an entire room full of people what it looks like when someone refuses to be ashamed of who they are. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where you felt like you didn't belong, where everyone seemed to have more to be more, and you had to decide whether to pretend or just be yourself? I'd love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. And if this one hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you there.